All right, everybody, I'm going to call you back to attention. We have Lisa up here now, ready to take all of your burning questions and solve all the problems of the world. So, where did we get with that question we posed when we asked, in what ways do we strive to be God within our context here in Ireland? Or if there are any other questions that came up during the course of your conversation, we could throw them out now. Just raise your hand, and we have James, who's had his Weetabix this morning, so he's going to be running at top speed.
Hi, Richard.
So, great. Philip.
Hi, thank you so much. Unbelievably, mind-blowingly amazing. And one of the little kind of things was around our Irishness, and you began by rooting us in our context. And I wonder if there's a kind of dual narrative that we have, and one of the narratives is that we are the most oppressed people. How can Africa talk about colonization when we've had 800 years of it? There were rules set to discriminate both against people of African descent and Irish in the United States. Frederick Douglass came to Ireland to meet Daniel O'Connell to talk about Catholic emancipation and black emancipation. In the 1960s, it wasn't just Martin Luther King singing "We Shall Overcome," it was John Hume singing "We Shall Overcome" in Derry. It was in the 1980s, the sign said, "No blacks, no Irish, no dogs need apply."
That's right. Yeah.
So one was this narrative of oppression, and that, we've experienced paddywhackery and persecution and so on. The other is a complete alternative, that the famous book, When the Irish Became White.
That's right, yeah.
And entered into all those power dynamics that you referred to. And the minstrel tradition was largely Irish, people of Irish ancestry. The role of the Irish in the police force and in the prison services.
Absolutely.
And therefore huge examples of racism. And huge issues of race and racism in Ireland. I mean, just last week there was an interracial couple. She was Irish, he was Brazilian. They appeared on an advertisement for Lidl, a shop, just to talk about buying oranges and bread. And they got such hate mail and death threats that they are going to leave Ireland. So I just want to know, because those two narratives are very dominant. And if you have any thoughts on those.
How do you deal with that, right? Oh my goodness, I'm so glad you asked that. I was thinking the same thing as I was even preparing this. It's a little bit, you guys are a little hard you are more complex in your experience of oppression, and also the fact that you have gained white status to some degree on this land. And so I had a conversation with a white woman friend of mine earlier this week, actually on Monday, and we were meeting over breakfast, and we were talking about patriarchy. And we were talking about the dynamics of white patriarchy and white women's experience of it and their relationship to women of color. And the thing that really hit me, and it wasn't like it's been hitting me over the last week, because it started last week in a whole other context, having that same conversation. Realizing that as people of color, we look at white women, and I think we might look across the pond and look and see you Irish folk and think y'all got it good. You know what I mean? Like, you're white. You actually have your own land, which is a very big deal. It's something that African Americans do not have. And we were taken from our land and now not owned by either, right? So, or taken back in by either. So, but she set me straight. She was like, you think we have it better, and to some degree they do, and she recognized that. But also, we have to sleep with them. Like, we have to sleep with patriarchy. We have to rear patriarchy, our sons. We have to live with, so we actually have to learn to navigate and survive patriarchy as white women. And that I was like, wow. So talk about being up close and personal with that. Now, what I'm not saying, don't hear me wrong, folks, I'm not saying white men are evil. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying white patriarchy is. Because what white patriarchy does is it creates and solidifies human hierarchy. And it determines that those who were called by God to exercise dominion in the land were people who are deemed white by the state and men. That is heresy. That is from the pit of hell. Because what it does is it crushes the image of God beneath it. And what my white woman friend was saying is, we get crushed too. And we've learned to navigate it, to survive it. And the way they survive it, the tactic of survival, and not just in the United States. I was in Brazil, and they do the same thing. They literally said, yep, we do this. Is when push comes to shove and they have to choose alignment with their womanhood, with other women of color, to stand with women of color, or alignment with their whiteness, they will choose their whiteness, because that keeps them in good graces with the patriarch, with the white patriarch. And that's why I think they got the death threats, because that woman was a race traitor. So I think that the way that I do it is to tease it out. It's actually a very similar dynamic that we find in mixed race people. People who, in America, who might have a white mother, like Obama, right? Like a white mother from England or from Portugal or from, somebody who's deemed white by the state. And a father or of African descent, and I don't just mean in terms of gender. It could be exchangeable, but that person holds all of it in their bodies, all of it. So there has to be a reckoning with both. There has to be a reckoning with the oppression. There has to be a reckoning with the shame of oppression. Because it's that shame, I believe, that drives you then to try to be God, to try to be the one in control. Because somehow over those centuries that you were dominated, you got in your head that what it looks like to be human is to be the dominator, is to be the one with the power to dominate. And anything less is less than human, and so we will not settle for that, so we must dominate. And that is also heresy. So we have to get in touch with the reality of the shame of being oppressed. And then we must face and reckon with the realities of the choices, the conversations we've had, and the choices we've made about how the polis will live together. And those choices, usually for folks in your situation or mixed race people, they involve bargains. They involve the ability to compromise on the full humanity of others so that you will feel like you've got power. So where are the places where you have made decisions in your politics that have either created or reinforced human hierarchy of belonging? That needs to be repented of. And not just in your hearts, but also in your politics. That's what I would say.
Okay, another question over the side.
Hello, thank you very much for your speech. It was inspiring. And one of the things that was going through my mind when I was listening to you was, I just happened to read a little article about Pope Francis and his encyclical on the climate. Mm-hmm. And this article that I was reading was about how he kind of, in a different way to before, he gets the relationship between people and the importance of people and the image of God in people, mm-hmm. and the image of God in the environment, and the relationship between kind of when we treat the environment correctly and care for it, we're lifting up people, and poor people who've been trodden on are lifted up, and we're giving a right balance. And I just, it was funny how it was a parallel in my mind, and I just thought that was an interesting way.
It is. It is. Did you have a particular question, or just, because I'd love to talk about that.
How do you think Pope Francis speaks, I guess, to kind of the whole dominion and power?
Well, it's interesting. Well, first, I honestly don't know enough about Pope Francis to actually answer that question the way that you've asked it. But what I would say is that, I think that his background as someone from the Southern Hemisphere, as someone of Latino descent, somebody who has in him both the oppressor and the oppressed, as someone who has both the Spaniard and the native person, the indigenous person, and possibly African descent as well in there, because that's what it means to be Latino. That as somebody who has all of that in him, he most likely has in him the ability to relate to the oppressed other. And I think we see that. I think that's why the world was so enamored with him in the first year of I almost said his presidency, the first year of his popedom, is because we saw for the first time ever, think about that, in 2,000 years, we saw for the first time ever a pope who came from the bottom, who came from the same social location as Jesus. Jesus did not come from the social location of empire. Jesus came from the social location of the oppressed, and so did this pope. And it's that pope that knelt and washed the feet of the leper, that washed the feet of those on the underside. Now, when you talk about the climate and you talk about environment and the environment holding the image of God, the way I understand is slightly different. I would say that the environment does not hold the image of God, but the environment does hold the breath of God. In fact, we actually see that in the text, that there's a part in this text in the sixth day where God talks about all that has the breath of God, everything that has the breath of life in verse 30. And that is everything. Everything has the breath of life. That means that plant, that tree, that frog, that whale, they all hold God's breath in them. And so they are sacred. They are sacred. And they are our cousins. They are our brothers and sisters in creation. They are our family in creation. And so we are responsible for them. And in a really odd way, God made us the last of all of creation, the youngest sibling, responsible for all the rest. Which is like, it's so God. It's so this text. This is what happens in this text always. The younger brother, the younger sibling ends up being the one to actually lead. But leadership is not dominion, or it's not rather domination. It is servanthood. It is cultivating. It is protecting. And so that's the call. I also believe that the environment is a witness. The environment literally witnesses whether we bless or curse. And by our actions, even we see it in Genesis 3, when we break shalom, when we break relationship with each other or with God, the environment stands bearing witness to that. There was a moment when I walked through, on that first pilgrimage, we walked through the Trail of Tears Park in southern Kentucky, near where my ancestors lived, where I believe they escaped into the hills and avoided the Trail of Tears. But on that land, they actually stopped there and corralled all the people and held them in a park in the midst of a blizzard winter, and many people died, including 2 chiefs. Well, all of the land that we had seen in Kentucky up to that moment was green, 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 just lush, like dark soil, rich soil. But when you get to this park, the land was parched, it was cracked, it was like it wasn't dark, it wasn't rich, and the trees wilted. It looked like the trees themselves were crying. It was incredible. And that land, I believe, bore witness to what happened there. I think the land bears witness. You can see the land bearing witness in Croatia and Bosnia and Serbia because the mines are still there. And you see creation bearing witness when you see boars that have been blown to bits running around in the woods with only 3 legs because they hit a mine. They bear witness of our sin. So if what it means actually to serve and protect creation, it's not only about having good relationship with creation, but it also is about maintaining the wellness of the relationships between all humanity and between us and God, because we were created in this intricate web of relationships where when one goes, they all go. Thank you so much.
Would you please give Lisa a hand, and we will have her back later.